and they will be introduced shortly. Our speakers today are Sherrard, Clay Eals is participating, and I'm not sure if Paul Dorpat is coming home. Okay, you may greet them. I'd also like to...
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning. Today, we are pleased to welcome a very special guest, Sherrard, who is a co-author of Washington Now and Then and Seattle Now and Then, Historic 100, along with Paul Dorpat. Sherrard has worked as an actor, writer, director, photographer, teacher, carpenter, and private detective. I'd like to talk about that one, please. He has now been the photographer of the Now series for the last 12 years. Today, he will be sharing with us a photographic history of Seattle, now and then. Please help me welcome Sherrard.
Well, thank you very much for having us. Paul woke up this weekend with a coronavirus, also known as the common cold. So first of all, let's dispel the myth that a coronavirus is only one thing. It's about 8,000 things. So I will stand in. This is a show taken largely from our book, which is about a year old, which several copies of which you can see perched up on the table over here. This is our cover photo, and we're very proud of it. It's been selling nicely for the last year, and we would love you to take home a couple copies, one for you and one for some relative across the country. And for those of you who have come from around the region and are not focused solely in Seattle, enjoy this introduction to our city. This is a short version of our program. This one is specifically the biggest, the deepest, the coldest, and the best, and the oldest. So let's take a look at some of these. We will start with, let's see if I can make sure that oh, there we go. Well, this is a slide from 1880, and it was taken of the snow that still holds the Seattle record for deepest snow. Now, once you get to Spokane, this record is broken fairly regularly, or up in the mountains, of course. But for Seattle, 1880 was a tough week in which 64 inches of snow fell. What you're looking at now is the corner of what's today First and Cherry. It's across from the studio of the Peterson brothers, photographers who had their studio right across the street. And they're looking up the street from their studio. Here is Henry Yesler's Hall. And here's the sheriff's house, and this is First Baptist Church of Seattle, which is now higher up on Capitol Hill. But so we're looking up, and that's about 4th Avenue now. We're standing at First Avenue looking up, and just to give you an example of how treacherous this was, the hall almost collapsed under the weight of the snow. So they sent men up onto the roof, and they paid them. There weren't that many people in town, and the men climbed out onto the roof and shoveled snow off roofs all over town for about $1 an hour, which was a lot in 1880. Now, what made this event particularly ironic was the snow began on January 5th, but on Sunday, January 4th, 1880, the Seattle PI published Elisha P. Ferry's declaration, his State of the Territory declaration. We weren't a state yet, so State of the Territory. And in that, it was really a bit of PR fluff, encouraging people to come to the state. And in his State of the Territory speech, which he delivered, but was now just for the first time published, he stated that Seattle climate was Mediterranean. And so by the time the week was out and 64 inches of snow had fallen, And it had done what Seattle snow always does, which is fall and melt and turn to ice, and then fall again and turn to ice. But by the end of the week, it was being said on the streets that if anyone says the word Mediterranean again, shoot them. So my job, and you'll see this in the book if you look a little closer, is to go back to the same location and repeat the photograph. And to get a snow photo, I'm always going down to First and Cherry, and it's one of those warm spots in town that rarely gets more than a dusting. So this last snow we had in January, I repeated, and you can see it was coming down really hard. It was the last day, and that's about as good as I've gotten it with lots of, you do your best to get to the same spot at the same time, but this is a pretty, so you can just see there's a heck of a lot of snow falling down, and at the very top, there's my red umbrella protecting the camera. Okay, so from deepest snow, we're going to look from the tallest building for most of the first half, well, the entire first half of the 20th century. This is from Smith Tower. It was taken by a photographer named Frank Noble in 1913, a year before the tower opened, a year and a half almost. And he got up, they had not yet put the skin on Smith Tower, which was the tallest building west of the Mississippi for many, many years throughout a significant portion of the 20th century. And there's Smith Tower. This is the view from the 40s, this is 35th floor. So he's looking down, and there's nothing between him and the skyline. They hadn't put the windows in. He's standing on a platform. And he was one of the first photographers to get up there and take this picture. And I found that it's always best to go a little bit higher to the observation deck. But before we go there, let's take a look, because you're going to see the same scene today. That, of course, is St. James Cathedral up on the hill. This is 1913. Here's Queen Anne Hill. There's Queen Anne High School. In the far distance, we're up here. We're right about up here. And this is Wallingford and University's right over here. And this is all downtown. Now remember, this is a very, very tall tower, and no one had seen a view of the city from these heights ever before. So it's kind of a spectacular early view, and photographers from this point, whenever there's a tall building, we like to go up there and shoot the view. Well, I repeated this, and you can see that a couple things have changed. Also, let me call your attention to the Rainier Club, right in the foreground here. Now that's going to be our focal point. So everything might alter around it, but there's our North Star. So let's go forward here. Well, you can't see much outside of, there's a couple things. There's the Rainier Club, and there is St. James, still up on the hill. Now, let's go up to St. James and take a look. This is St. James in 1912, 1911, and it was taken when St. James had a dome. Now, our deepest snow was in 1880, but one of our most destructive snows was in 1916, and it was the second deepest snow. And that snow, the first snow didn't collapse Yestler's Hall. They managed to shovel the snow off the roof. But this little dome, which had been, this was dedicated in 1907, end of 07. And so it had been up about 9 years. And in 1916, a freeze hit Seattle on a big snow, and it landed on top of that dome, and here was the result one morning. So the dome collapsed. Amazingly, it actually happened in the afternoon, but in the morning, that same morning, there had been a mass, and girls from Holy Name School had filled the cathedral. Within a couple hours, the dome collapsed, but no one was killed. So it was, and in fact, the architects blamed a beam that was sent from New York. It had to be New York's fault. When, on the 100-year anniversary of the February 2nd, 1916 collapse of the dome, the cathedral held a special service thanking God for not destroying the entire cathedral and for sparing all those lives. Well, I went up into their oculus, which has now replaced the dome, and shot the service from above. And this was a treacherous little climb, but shooting down on, and this is the 100th year anniversary of the actual collapse of the dome. Well, this is for those of you who know Seattle history, this is a fairly well-known picture. It's the Monongahela. And it has an interesting story. It was built in 1882 in Glasgow, a four-master. And it traveled the world and ended up being sold to a German company. But when the war broke out, the First World War broke out, it was still plying the waters. It was in the Columbia. And we entered the war in 17, and instantly the U.S. Board of Shipping confiscated the Monongahela, turned it into, from a German warboat, because it was stranded, there was no way they could get back across out of Allied waters. So very quickly they turned it into the Monongahela, and it traveled between Manila and Seattle and the West Coast. So this is February, no, it's April of 1931. The Monongahela is leaving Lake Union. And what you're looking at above here is the closing of the Aurora Bridge, also known, and some of you can chant this with me, the George Washington Memorial Bridge. So we're looking at the top girders are just about to be shut, and they were bringing out all the tall-masted ships that had been parked in Lake Union, and the Monongahela had been there for several years. And it was taken out, first towed to Eagle Harbor across Puget Sound, and then sold to a Vancouver company where it became a log barge. So that was its ignominious end, but what a gorgeous ship. Probably one of the last four-masters to be seen in Lake Union, of this height anyway. Well, I go back and again, I try to repeat it, and you can see that I did find a sailboat, however. You can see it's coming out under and they actually, this was tall enough they had to raise the Fremont Bridge for it to get through. Well, this is the Taft Key. It was given to President Taft by the fellow who found the first chunk of gold in the Yukon. His name was George Carmack. And he became so wealthy that he started to distribute honorary, well, in this case, he made a solid gold telegraph key out of Alaskan gold. And it's decorated with nuggets from his claim. And it's mounted on a slab of Alaskan marble. And he gave it to President Taft to open the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, which happened in Seattle right here in 1909. And so Taft, in DC, pressed the key, and that was the sign for the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, our first World's Fair to begin. Well, we now go up to the top deck of the Aurora Bridge, or the George Washington Memorial Bridge. And it was opened formally and officially. This is February 22nd, 1932, 200 years after the birth of George Washington. So what you see now is the celebrants from both sides. This is North Seattle up here, where we are, and on this side it's Queen Anne Hill. And down below is the waterway where the Monongahela passed through under the bridge the year before. Well, as this bridge was it's being dedicated, and the governor of the time, Roland Hartley, was a fierce opponent of interstate construction projects. And this bridge was part of 99. And Hartley was just deeply opposed to spending any money outside of his hometown of Everett. And he was governor, but he was not a collaborator, shall we say. But when he saw the crowds for this bridge, he was thrilled, and he stood up on the dais and he pronounced He took credit for the building, he boasted, and what he hadn't counted on, however, was he was a bit of a loquacious and a bloviator. And what he hadn't counted on was that at 2:57 in the afternoon, on a Monday, President Hoover was waiting with his finger perched above the Taft key. And at 2:57, he was going to press that key, and when he pressed the key at 2:57, he interrupted Roland Hartley mid-speech. Not only did he interrupt him, but from the hill, field artillery were sending great cannon fire. The fireboats down below, the little fireboat Alki, was sending great plumes of water up over the bridge in celebration. Great, enormous flags were unfurling from every side, and the crowd streamed out onto the bridge, thousands and thousands of them. And Hartley never finished his speech. And there's the bridge from that same spot today. Here's Hoover, and this is the moment when he's using the Taft key. It was used by, I think, 9 presidents between Taft and well, you'll see, the next president who used it in connection with the Seattle event. Let's take a look. Well, same Taft key. This is for the Seattle World's Fair. And President Kennedy opened the Seattle World's Fair by pressing the Taft key and setting off balloons and streamers and cannons. Meanwhile, in Seattle, it's October. The fair has been open for several months. This is in the last month of the fair. And the 9 millionth visitor passes through the gates. It's a young Paula Dahl, who's 6 years old at the time. There she is going through she's just come through the gates, and a sign is draped around her neck. She's given a big dog. Her parents are so proud. The political powers that be are behind her. They've just draped this wonderful sign around her neck. And behind her, you can see her very unhappy sister, Nancy. I don't know if their relationship ever recovered. But Paula, we found in Issaquah. And here she is today with her classroom. And on the wall of her classroom, she keeps the 9 millionth sign and tells the story of how she won the prize. And the prize was to spend a full day as a VIP. And she said at 6 years old, she had to give a speech at the Flag Plaza. And her speech was something like, "Hello." Okay, we're proceeding through now. Well, this is the Seattle Fire of 1889, the same year of our statehood. And in 1889, this is June 6th, a little after 2 in the afternoon, and a carpenter of my ancestry, Norwegian, tipped over a glue pot, and it caught the ashes on fire in this little carpentry shop down on 1st and Madison. And Front Street in Madison, and you can see this is one of the few, whoops, let me go back. This is one of the, now I have to find my way back here. Oh, come on, back. This is one of the handful of photos that have been taken of the fire itself, because most of the photographers realized what was going on, and they were running to save their photographic equipment. This is taken from 1st and Spring, which is just up the street from that oldest snow photo. So the Peterson brothers are pulling all their equipment out of their studios. All the photographers are evacuating their studios. This was taken by poor William Boyd, who took a handful of photos of the fire itself, and then had his studio burned down. So he made some sacrifices. We don't know if he managed to save any equipment, but that's why there are only half a dozen photos of the fire, because the photographers were running to save themselves and their equipment. So this is a pretty rare photo looking down from 1st and Spring, and after the fire, within one day, 30 blocks of Seattle had burned down. No one died. Wikipedia claims that one person died, but it's a lie. Nobody died, only a bunch of rats. They say thousands of rats, but we look at it today and we can see the resolution that they made to rebuild the city in brick and stone. And that was on June 7th, the next morning. all the early residents of the city met in one of the great halls, and they all, by popular acclamation, said, we're going to rebuild, Seattle will be a phoenix, and we'll build in brick and stone. So you can see some of those bricks and stones right here. This is, again, the day, maybe 2 days after the fire, and we're looking right now at, pay attention to this structure here, which is the 3-story monolith at the front of the Occidental Hotel. And I think some of you might recognize exactly where we are, but let's go forward. There's where the front of the Occidental stood once. It's now called, for Seattleites, we call it the Sinking Ship Garage. It's down in Pioneer Square. We go forward. You can see that right after the fire, and the Occidental Hotel burned down, they built a beautiful new hotel in its place called the Seattle Hotel. And here it is, on that triangle. And that's where that monolith stood. This is about 1908, probably the Great White Fleet was visiting. And, but you can see it's 8 years before Smith Tower would be up behind, but let's take a look at it today, and you can see what's replaced it. So we have this glorious Smith Tower here, and down below our another hideous ruin, the sad and bedraggled sinking ship. And you can see that it kind of extends into the ground in a strange way. But there's one, let's get a little close up here. One thing about the sinking ship garage is that it was done with some sensitivity. The architects at the time were preparing for the Seattle World's Fair, so this is 1960 or so when this was put up. But they tried to reflect the environment. So one of the things that they did was to make sure that they took these basket-handled windows behind in this old building and repeated it in the bars on top of the, and I mean very sarcastic here. That's their one gesture towards sensitivity in architecture, is those bars repeating the basket-shaped windows. Well, one thing about the destruction of this great hotel, which many preservationists mourn, because it was taken down in '58. One thing about the destruction of it is that it was the destruction that launched a preservation project. Because in the '60s, we wanted to take down the Pike Place Market and replace it with condos, replace it with parking garages, and a man named Victor Steinbrook stepped in. He was an architect and a brilliant guy, and he stepped in and said, we can't do that. Remember the Seattle Hotel, how beautiful that was. And we lost it 5 years ago. We've got to save the market. So he launched a campaign to save the Pike Place Market. And here you can see an early photograph from 1907 of the market as it's being established. And we'll look at it today. And there it is. There's a place that we all love, and think of the tourist dollars we'd lose if we had taken down that market. At the very tip of the market, the north end, right down beyond, right by this building down here, in front of it there's a park, and it's the Victor Steinbrook Park, named after Victor, who arguably was the force behind saving. There we have an unusual picture. I'll give you a hint where it's from. Anyone want to guess? Where is this photo taken in Seattle? Where could it be? Yeah, raise your hand, shout it out. Say again?
Right here.
No, right here? No, this is a photo from the not the 18, the 1950s. And it was taken by an Austrian who came to town in 1939 named Werner Belengenhager. Amateur photographer, but he provided some of the most lovely pictures of our city before some changes occurred. He worked for Boeing, and when he retired in the mid-60s, then he just spent all his remaining days photographing. Well, here it is today. So we're looking looking at I-5, and that little alley was very close to where this picture is taken. So there are some big changes that we've seen over the past, and we've seen even more. If you walk around downtown Seattle and you've been here for 10, 20 years, you will see so many alterations that will just kind of, it sort of rocks your world. Around here, student housing has taken over little houses in neighborhoods. It's really quite extraordinary. So we do look for those touchstones like the market to kind of touch down and say, oh, I remember this place. Okay, so for now, for the children of the American Revolution, the next slide, I want you to cover your eyes. This picture is taken in April of 1940. It is the second to last trolley car line to exist in Seattle. All the downtown lines have been gotten rid of. The Finney line was second to last. And this is 1 year before this trolley was taken off the line, and they were all replaced by gasoline-powered buses. So the trolleyman was another amateur photographer, took this picture of his trolley, and within a year it was gone. And I remember my grandmother and mother saying how much they missed the trolleys. That's one sacrifice we've made. Now this was taken on the corner of 34th and Fremont. And on that same corner, we have a parade every summer. So again, please avert your eyes, because you're about to see our replacement for the trolley, which is two women walking abreast. Okay, so onward. Same spot, 34th and Fremont. Another huge change which affected the extraordinarily generous tribe of Chief Seattle, the Duwamish, is the Black River, which when Lake Washington was lowered by 9 feet, disappeared. And this is a 1906 excursion reported on by the PI of women and men going down in canoes attempting to get from Lake Washington to Puget Sound. In 1906, the Black River Passage was the only way to get from Washington to Puget Sound. But when the locks opened up, the Black River was dropped down, or Lake Washington dropped by 9 feet, and the Black River disappeared. Now, the reason I mentioned the Duwamish tribe is because they, of course, were, we are on their land, put it that way. And they've been here for 10 to 12,000 years. And so it's important to remember that lowering the Black River ended their 10,000 years of village life along that river. So there were sacrifices that were made, and perhaps we should acknowledge that we're now on their land. And here we are at that same spot, which is in Renton. And this is Rainier Avenue South, and about a mile from where I was born, Renton General Hospital. And here's Carl from the Brown Bear Car Wash, happily standing in for the boating couples. You know, we always get that response from the colloquial. It's because it's just so beautiful. And some people would suggest that perhaps the colloquial was built in the 30s and was to lift the spirits of people in the Depression. It certainly did. You'd see this colloquial wandering across the Sound from Bainbridge to Seattle and back and forth. Who would, you'd look at this, and it was called the Flying Bird. And the colloquial was designed by an avant-garde designer, Norman Bell Geddes, and it was beloved. It did have one little flaw. First, let's look at this. This is going through the locks, and we don't know why, but this is, I think this is, let me check my date. It is in April of 47. You can see the upper deck of the colloquial is filled with people, as are all the windows, and they're slowly being towed through the locks from Lake Union into the Sound. And we don't quite know why, but now Clay Eals is going to pop up, and he's going to demonstrate, because I never rode in the colloquial. But Clay did, and now he's going to demonstrate one of the weaknesses of the Kalaka.
Well, I'm not the only one. There are people in this room, I'm sure. How many of you rode on the Kalaka? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, about a half dozen. It was quite the experience. I was really fortunate to be on one of its last runs. It was in June of 1967 when our high school stage band was going to Bremerton for the Olympic College Festival of Stage Bands. And the upper floors of the Kalaka were closed off. They were cordoned off and there were spider webs everywhere. It was kind of a spooky experience to ride. But the primary thing that some of you probably can verify was the audio, the oral experience. The walls literally shook. When the Kalaka took off, it resembled this kind of a sound with the walls moving, going all the way across to Bremerton. Anybody remember that? Anyway, it was part of the beloved Kalaka.
Thank you, Clay. Give Clay a round of applause for his impression of the Kalaka. Well, again, I went back to the, I was looking for something that could stand in for the Kalaka, and to my surprise and delight, I found early one morning the USS Turner Joy, which in August of 1964 joined the Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, and that was the beginning of the Vietnam War. And it is a museum ship in Bremerton if you have any inclination to visit it, and quite beautiful. But it was coming back from a month in harbor being repainted and freshened up. There it is off the Gulf of Tonkin. And now a very quick, we're coming to the end of our show. Well, this we have to feature, it's the viaduct. And this was taken the day before it opened in April of '53. And I love these two women, both dressed in red. They're probably models for some ad agency featuring the viaduct. You can see Smith Tower up there. It's still, at this point, the tallest building in the West Coast. And I went back a couple years ago to take this picture just before it was torn down, knowing, of course, that it would be torn down. And I did get a red car. And then just a week ago, I went back to a similar location, as close as I could get. And you can see the entrance to the 99 tunnel, which has replaced the viaduct. And there's the stacks of air filters cleaning out the air. And finally, our last couple images, this is the oldest house in Seattle still standing. It was built and owned by Doc Maynard in West Seattle. He built it after he moved to West Seattle in the late 50s and built a house which burned down. This was his replacement house. In '68, he sold it to a family, the Olson-Hanson family, and you know their great-grandson, Ivar. So this is Ivar's mother in the white, his grandmother, his grandfather, and Snidely Whiplash over to the side here. And the house was on the right near the water, and they moved it in 1905 to this location. And this is from about 2 weeks ago, and Clay is writing up a column about this. These are the descendants gathered from all over the country of Doc Maynard. So they came they delivered us a bunch of letters from the dock that they had found that no one has ever seen before. In our very last image, we go back to the Duwamish in Chief Seattle. This is Princess Angeline, named Princess Angeline. Her name was actually Kiki Sopu. She was named Princess Angeline or nicknamed by Maynard's wife, Catherine. And she would take in laundry and sell her baskets and pose for photographs on the street. This is from the early 90s. There's an inset of one of only 2 photos ever taken of Chief Seattle. This is the only portrait, like a specific portrait of Seattle. And she is now in this location. The 2 people sitting in on the right is Ken Workman, who is the great-great-great-great-grandson of Chief Seattle. And on the left is Mary Lou Slaughter, who is the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Princess Angela. They're wearing, Mary Lou has taken on her great-grandmother's skill set, and she is probably the greatest basket maker and weaver amongst the Duwamish still living in the area. If you get a chance, go to the Duwamish Longhouse, where you will see her basket weaving designs cover the parquet floor. And she's a marvel. Both of them are extraordinary representatives of the Duwamish, and many stories flow from that. But we will finish with this last photo of me taking a picture of them in the market on the corner of First and Pike. And as I was taking the picture, Ken several times just kind of jerked around. And he called out, and I said, "What's wrong, Ken?" And Clay actually took this photo of me taking the picture of them. And I said, "What's wrong, Ken?" He said, "Well, someone's trying to get through. Just take the picture, Gene, take the picture." And afterwards I said, "What were you talking about?" He said, "Someone kept tapping me on the elbow." And Ken thinks, he has some particular theories about just who was tapping him on the elbow. For me, I think of this as when I find a spot, when everything locks in, and I see this, I'm standing in the same place that a photographer stood 150 years ago. There's a little nudge of history. And I think that's what tapped Ken on the elbow. So thank you very much. It was a delight to welcome you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do have time for a few questions. Do we have any questions for Jean?
Question?
Gene, your first photograph showed Cherry Street and a small building in the middle of the street. Was that a news?
It's interesting. We've only had that question asked twice, and the last time it was asked was at the Rainier chapter. So it's interesting that the daughters are the most curious about that one structure. And the truth is, we don't know. No one has ever said this was a little news shack, or there were only, our population was not large at that point when the photo was taken. There were 3,000 people. We were right on the verge of overtaking the largest city in the state, which was, can anyone tell me, 1880 largest town, 79? No, eastern side. Walla Walla. So in 80, we overtook Walla Walla, and we were so proud. We now had more than 3,000, yeah.
So I just had a quick question about the Finney Ridge trolley.
Yeah.
I think I answered it, so I just want to confirm that there's what looks like a cow catcher on the front of it, and I know there weren't cows in Finney Ridge in the 20s or whatever. Is that a bike rack?
No, you are correct. It is a cow catcher. In fact, if you look, there's a wonderful book about animals in Seattle, and up on Finney Ridge. And the trolley is older than 40. I mean, it had been in service for decades. So there are some we actually did a column about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, featuring animal life in the city, and there were cows up on Finney Ridge, yeah, and in Fremont. So they might go for a wander, but yes, it wasn't for bikes. It was to shove animals and recalcitrant people out of the way.
What do you think is the one thing in Seattle that you would hate to see lost?
Well, my touchstone in Seattle, I go back there, fairly often. It's sort of a central focal place for me, because I've been going there since I was a kid, is the market. So for me, the Pike Place Market has, it's not about the buildings, it's about the interaction between people. And it's not, if you've been to San Francisco and seen their equivalent, Fisherman's Wharf, it's much more touristy and commercial, whereas in the market, for Mother's Day, for Valentine's Day, for Easter. Everyone shows up from all over the city, comes down to the market, as my great-grandmother and grandmother and mother and father, and as they all went down, they trooped down to the market. And that's where I feel the imprint, the nudges from my own family past. And my great-grandfather came to Seattle the year before the fire from Chicago. And he ended up actually in the first graduating class in the North Campus of the UW. So he became a teacher in town.
Maybe about one more question we have time for?
One more.
You didn't mention the interurban, waiting for the interurban.
Oh,
And that's a favorite of mine.
it's in the book.
Well, okay. People decorate it. So tell us why it's there. Was that a stop for the trolley?
It was, the tracks actually ran right down and around. And and so in the book you can see we have the workers digging into the road to lay those tracks, which were part of that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, coming up from 34th, that was, you could go to the right when you reached, across the bridge, or you could head up the hill. So, yeah. Thank you so much. And if you have more questions, come and talk to us later. Clay is here as well. And there's a lovely Seattle book. Thanks so much for having us.
DAR, come right back up here. We'd like to present you with an honorarium and then also a certificate. This certificate is awarded to Jean Sherrard in sincere appreciation of your presentation at the 111th George Washington Memorial Statue Celebration. You really brought a wonderful element of history, and we are the daughters of the American Revolution, and history is right up our alley. So thank you so much.